My name is Nancy Capistran. I'm a Greater Boston Peer Advisory Group Chair for CEOs, as well as an award-winning internationally certified executive coach and crisis advisor. I'm pleased to introduce Tara Goodwin, who is my business partner at Crisis Interception. Since founding her first company, Goodwin PR, in 2001, Tara attracts, engages, and sustains clients ranging from startups and nonprofits to multi-million-dollar companies, high-profile CEOs, professional athletes, and coaches. She is considered an expert in media relations, crisis management, strategic events, and effective content development and curation. Tara leads decisive change in times of extreme adversity. She provides mental toughness, uncommon agility, sensitivity, professionalism, and sound counsel. Tara has won numerous awards throughout the years. I am thrilled that she is with us today. We have a 3-part podcast series. This first one is going to be specifically around embracing risk and navigating crisis. We will guide our listeners through the best ways to prepare for crisis, from where you start to how you should respond to what shareholders want most from companies in crisis. We will cover topics no one wants to talk about but should before it's too late. Preparing for a crisis is where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Why you should prepare for the inevitable and why many CEOs neglect to do it until they actually face a real crisis. Tara, what are the reasons why most CEOs do not prepare for crisis, and why should we?
Well, thanks for having me, Nancy. I'm delighted to be here. And I'll tell you why CEOs don't prepare for crisis. And it's interesting because I speak across the country to CEOs and help them understand why they should prepare for crisis. And the biggest reason is that crisis planning is not a revenue generating event. And CEOs will say, it's going to happen, maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to worry about it. Things are going very well. So I'm not going to focus my efforts on crisis planning. It's only when they have a crisis that they then come back after we help navigate through a crisis and say, you know what? I think we should have a plan. And it's backwards. And so our goal as Crisis Interception is to try to teach CEOs why it's important to prepare. When you're prepared, it makes you a better communicator in a crisis. You know what you're going to say, maybe not necessarily to the specific crisis, but it enables you to have a roadmap. And that's what we aim to do.
You know, it's interesting. I know we've talked about this a number of times, but it always amazes me, and I think yourself as well. I mean, you've traveled across the country doing many different speaking engagements, whether it's through Vistage or other engagements. And, you know, I'm curious, what percentage of the CEOs that you interact with actually have some kind of a crisis plan in place?
Lower than you think, less than 25%. Of the room. And you know, it's funny because we'll say this is a safe space, just want to see a show of hands, and then when you see a quarter of the audience's hands going up, I usually say to them, you're not alone, and that's why I'm here. And it's something that can be easily fixed, but you have to commit to it.
And talk a little bit about what the difference is. You know, what do we see when somebody's in crisis and they've not put a plan together versus those that have?
Well, as you say, it's, what is your phrase that you use that I love? Something with better precision.
Oh, smarter decisions with better precision.
100% all the way. It helps you make smarter decisions. When you're in a crisis, your blood pressure is raised, you're panicking, you're not sure what to do. You may or may not have a crisis team, which we're going to talk about in this section again and why it's important. So when you're out there by yourself, you're not making the best decisions. You don't have a team to help you. You're not sure which way to go. You don't have somebody coming in and taking the pulse of the influencers in your company and the stakeholders. So you really need to have a plan because it gives you a peace of mind. It's almost like an insurance policy for your company, but with a slightly different twist.
Yeah, and it's also kind of about how you do business continuity. How do you run your business while also dealing with the crisis and you're drinking from a fire hose because every second counts, right? So you're trying to toggle two different things that both require a tremendous amount of experience and time and energy. And when you're dealing with a crisis, that's often something that you don't have a lot of experience with. So if you are planning ahead, then you at least have that baseline of what's needed to start the process. Would that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And in a crisis, good enough is not good enough because there are going to be mistakes unless you've thought about what are your worst case scenarios? What are you most afraid about when you're laying in bed at night? Is it a natural disaster? Is it an industrial accident? Is it an active shooter coming into your company? There are so many different crises that you and I have handled over the years, Nancy, that if you don't think about them, you're not going to know how to respond to them or even thinking about how to respond to them. And then when they happen, you're way behind the curve because you can't make smart decisions.
And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of where, when, and how severe.
Absolutely. And we've seen that time and time again. I've had many CEOs say to me, I'm not going to worry about this. Or a lot of times I'll talk about national crises and how CEOs handle them from larger companies. And they'll say, that doesn't affect me. And I say, yes, it does, because your audience may be smaller, but the crisis situation is still the same. The spotlight is on you and your company, and how you act and react is going to determine whether your stakeholders trust you, which is the most important piece of acting in a crisis.
Yeah. And I think it's also when the pre-planning is done, or at least some foundation there, it's peace of mind, right? So that you know at least where to begin. You might not be able to plan for all of the options that could happen, but you at least know where to start. So let's talk a little bit about that. What should people do first?
Well, the first thing that I usually do when a company wants to engage in a crisis plan is sitting down with a team of people, and we'll talk about the crisis team shortly. But it's thinking about those worst case scenarios. What are we most concerned about? Of the top 100 crises that could possibly be out there, what 10% of those are most likely to impact our business? And depending on what kind of business you operate, you can definitely categorize those. And as you know, there's a wide range. So you've got, you know, the national public health disaster, whether it's COVID, Omicron, Delta, monkeypox, you name it. There are health crises. Then there are administrative scandals. And Nancy, I mean, we've dealt with that. And, you know, one of the most interesting pieces that came out of those when we worked together is companies, people who've worked together for years, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Can you elaborate on that? Because I just found that absolutely astounding. And I know you did too.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many different situations where that's happened, and there's been a couple of times where it's been CFOs that have been stealing from the company, and they were like family, and like couldn't just blown away. And I think the one that most resonated with me, kind of like in a shock and awe, was that somebody who they had been they founded the company together, and it was 19 years in, and the individual just justified taking money from the company to do other things. And it wasn't until he knew that the company was actually going to be audited, and they had an outside auditing company. They had a board, and he was still able to maneuver this for 19 years. And I still remember the CEO when he told us what happened, and he just was flabbergasted that this could have happened.
Well, and not only flabbergasted, but he said the line that gave me the absolute chills and actually backs up why we do what we do. Do you remember? He said, had I only looked at the books, I would have caught it. So for however many years this had gone on, and I forget, he hadn't looked at the books. And if he had just taken a look, he would have seen it, because he would have seen invoices for equipment that they never purchased.
Yeah.
And that's how the embezzlement happened.
Yeah.
And that's just awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different situations that we've had that have been around that space. And it's not, trust, I think, is important, but validating too, right? Just to make sure, because we're human beings too, and we make mistakes. But sometimes, he would have caught that many years prior to that if he was a little bit more engaged in more of the, holistic view of the organization. And as a CEO, that's some things that are important. You don't want to have blind spots. And, he did. And it was unfortunate. So let's talk a little bit about the crisis team. You referenced that earlier. Let's kind of vet that out a little bit as far as who the primary people should be on your crisis team.
Sure. So when you think about it, it depends on the size of your company. So if you have a 10-person company, you're only going to have a 2 or 3 person crisis team. If you have a larger company, you may have a 15 to 20 person crisis team. You don't want it to be too large, but you also want to make sure that you have the right decision makers on board. So who are those people? Obviously, it's the CEO, the head of the company. We call that the one throat to choke theory, because when a CEO is in crisis, and a company is in crisis, stakeholders want to see the CEO. They want to see that person up there explaining what happened, what he or she is going to do about it, and why it happened. So those are intrinsic parts of why the CEO should be the front person in a crisis. But that CEO needs support. So if there's a vice president, if there's an HR director, if there are different managers that have varying divisions. So let's say your company has 4 or 5 different divisions. You might want the heads of those divisions, because the idea is to be able to have a quick information exchange back and forth from those divisions if needed. So you want to make sure that all of those people are involved. And then what you can also do is you can have them be crisis team members, but they don't have to be core team members. So if the crisis happens in a particular division, you would actually go to that manager and maybe exclude some of the other division heads. So you have to kind of pick and choose. The other people who should be on your crisis team are IT. So data breach and ransomware, as you and I both know, are very real, ongoing, and despite how much security you have, you're absolutely going to get hacked at one point or another. It's just inevitable. We've seen it happen to companies that are completely locked down. So you want IT. You also want to have a legal counsel. Larger companies have in-house legal counsel. Smaller companies have outsourced counsel, but you definitely want your lawyer. And then the other person that you want is your VP of marketing communications, because communications is responsible for disseminating messages about the crisis. Lawyers are there to ensure that when PR people communicate, they're not violating anything that could get a company into legal hot water. And it's usually this kind of, I don't want to say battle, but it's a spirited discussion, because I always joke that lawyers don't want to say anything and PR people want to say too much, right? So you want to make sure that there's a balance.
Yeah.
And then looking at the whole organization, I always say there's another person who should be on your crisis team, which is the one person who you have grudging respect for, but he or she makes your blood boil. You don't necessarily get along with that person. You wouldn't invite them to Thanksgiving dinner, but you have a grudging respect because you know they're smart and you know they do a good job. And the reason I say that person should be part of your crisis team is because often there are leaders and executives who will drink the CEO Kool-Aid. So the CEO will come out and say, "This is my decision," and everybody will be nodding their heads like those little dogs in the back of cars. And this person will say, that's not going to work, and state the reasons why. And whether or not you go that route or not as a crisis response, having that person makes you think about the crisis on a whole nother level rather than just a more narrow focus.
Yeah, and I think this is another person that oftentimes gets forgotten about. And it's somebody within the finance department, whether it's the CFO, the director of finance, whatever that is. But because it's going to be spent, there's going to be a need for that. And it's often, that's unbudgeted. So you got to figure that piece of it out. So having that person at the table is also very helpful.
It's true.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nancy.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
When you're thinking about the crisis team too, you are a Vistage chair. And people don't necessarily think that the groups that they belong to, the business groups like Vistage, which is absolutely locked down and so secure and confidential, those members that you have gone to meetings with in your organization can be a huge sounding board to help you navigate through crisis. I know that I've helped chairs navigate through crisis situations, and I'm sure as a chair, you've helped your members do that as well. And you can call what is called tiger teams or special teams to actually come in. And that could be part of your crisis team, especially if you're a small company.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So let's talk a little bit about identifying the worst case scenarios. Obviously, this is going to be different for every industry, right? And even within an industry, when you dive down a little bit deeper, it's just going to look differently. But let's talk a little bit about some of those worst case scenarios and how each of them can kind of figure out what their worst case scenarios could be.
Well, I think it's important to, once the CEO has thought about the worst case scenarios, what they then can do is call that crisis team together and have a vibrant dialogue and conversation about what do you think the worst case scenarios are? Because I guarantee everyone has a different seat at the table and they have a
Yeah.
different perspective from what they're seeing. So when they have these conversations, you're going to get 4 or 5, 6 different scenarios that you haven't even thought about. And then once you get those scenarios, categorize them in order of importance, and they will be different for different companies and organizations. Manufacturing companies, it's all about equipment failure, data breaches, employee accidents on the job, active shooters if they fire someone, employee pickets and protests. So that might be one specific category. Financial software company might be data breach, embezzlement. There are all different layers. So it's really asking the executive team, what keeps you up at night? Trucks that are on the road, when they have an accident, you see the helicopter overhead on the news, zeroing in on the logo of the company.
Yeah.
That scares a lot of people that I work with and help.
Rightly so. Rightly so. And the other one that I think, because we all think we're invincible, is that we've had CEOs that, one, I can think of 2 situations that we've dealt with. One of them coming out of the Celtics game, was on the Mass Pike, has a massive heart attack, drove off the road and died. And he was in the middle of a major acquisition, and all of that intellectual property died with him. And, then what does the company do when they don't have succession planning in place? So there's a lot to be thinking about. A lot of times people think that we CEOs are always going to be there, and that's not always the case. And what happens, like the law firm, you remember when the law firm called us in because it was a family business, it was 2 brothers, and the managing partner, he was in excellent health. He ran all the time, very athletic, just had his annual checkup that day. That night he fell asleep, had a massive coronary, and never woke up. And the law firm just fell apart. And that's when we were brought in to try to help with all the logistics, not only in the day-to-day, like how do they recover from this, but also how do they handle the media and the communications. And we talked about that. And oftentimes people don't even realize you need to be communicating internally as well as externally. And that's a delicate balance to be able to do that, but also making sure that there's consistent messaging in that.
And this all dovetails back to, if you have a plan for it, it's much easier to navigate through, because thinking about a death is such an emotional experience for all the people left behind that work with that leader, and how are they going to move forward. And if there's a plan in place and someone is anointed that you're going to take over this role should something happen, it's easier. And if you share information, because a lot of times CEOs don't share information. I know that when you were working with the gentleman who died outside of the Celtics game, there were some deals in progress, and you were able to help save a couple of them, but there were a couple that couldn't be, and that's frustrating. It's dollars lost, and that didn't have to happen.
Right. Sometimes it just doesn't. So our message here is please try to pre-plan. So let's, I just want to close this up by saying a little bit about our second part is going to be about the anatomy of an effective crisis response. And so we'll be talking about that next. We wanted to thank you for your time. Tara, thank you so much for spending the time and sharing with the audience all of your areas of expertise.
Always happy to be here with you, Nancy.
Thanks very much.